All right. Okay. Let's do this whole rigmarole again. Let me go back just a few seconds to replay what he said, and I'll replay my response. Let's go from right there. Yeah, no, I actually spent over 12 hours fixing the audio issue yesterday. I started at 2 p.m. and I went till 7 a.m. fixing audio issues. I actually missed some engagements that I had for today, some commitments that I had to miss them. Was able to get to a baby shower, and so very congratulations to Grace. I know she watches. And yeah. But yeah, no, I was having audio issues yesterday. The mic is good now. It took a lot of adjusting for it to get good again. And it was an update that just simply knocked out my previous settings, which I didn't write down, so I didn't know what they were. So yeah, and I didn't remember how to get back to them. So, all right, so let's get back to this. We'll do it again from Joshua Bowen talking.
I guess his whole method for promoting the gospel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that so often, just to sort of piggyback on that, so often there's this idea among Christian apologists in particular, where they will say, well, we're not starting with our conclusion. What we've done is we've done all this research, we've done all this work, and we've come to this conclusion, right? But the reality is that, as you're sort of intimating here, they've had an experience, right? And when you talk to them, really, it's so few people that I interact with that are speaking to me with any kind of honesty are saying, I was like logicked into my Christianity.
So as I was just saying, I think that's unfair. That's a very unfair comment to make. So for me personally, I always believed in God, but that doesn't mean that I was going to end up as a Christian. I actually read all of this stuff long before I came to Christianity. Sorry, there was a funny joke in the chat. My heart, be still my beating heart. I started off believing in God, but that doesn't mean I was going to end up being a Christian. I could have been, and I was a Taoist for many, many years. And I read the Bible 3 times before I could even buy into it. And then it took me another 3 times before I accepted it completely. And then I had to read it one more time after that before I really started to understand what it was saying. That's 7 times all the way through. And then even from there, I had to read other things as well. Like I went through the church fathers, I went through church commentary. And right now I'm still reading church commentary because there's so much of it. Even after you go over the initial patristic text, I have about 120 books that I need to get through to have read the commentary surrounding just the New Testament. Okay, I have 120 books on my TBR to be read, so I can read all the major texts surrounding the commentary on the New Testament. And this is just a primary text, mind you. I don't speak Latin. I don't speak German. I'm reading translations, but I'm reading the actual translations of this. All right, so let's keep going. So I don't think this is a fair assessment. There are plenty of people like myself who come to Christianity through an intellectual or reasoned process. Now, maybe that might be unique to Orthodoxy and to Catholicism. I don't know. I can't speak for Protestantism on that.
Right. It was just overwhelming, the evidence from archaeology. It proved to me like there are just so few people that say that. No, they
How's
say,
that, Sam?
Look, I had a personal experience with Jesus
odd.
Christ.
Is that better?
And I know that he's my Lord and Savior. And hey, you know what? That's great. But I think being able to recognize that, because what happens then is you come.
Just to be clear, I sounded like I was in a bucket for the last 3 recordings, and there's like 10 recordings other than that I haven't put out that are never going to go out. So the volume's a little high because I was setting max adjustments to get rid of that sound.
Then to the data with that conclusion
Yeah.
in mind. And so I have a friend, and that's what I was looking up here. But he wrote his dissertation on Daniel and looking at
There was just like a small chance that it was me. Like there's a small chance, and then then he said doctorate, and then it couldn't be me. Now I'm sad. Now I need counseling.
the figure, potential figure of Saxeres II has a potential for Darius the Mede. But he has this note, and I wrote in the book that it's far from objective, right? Because listen to what he says. Most importantly, Daniel was a prophet who wrote infallibly under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, whereas extra-biblical sources for the life of Cyrus are ordinary human writings. Since God was speaking through Daniel as he wrote, the book of Daniel is not to be viewed as an account of uncertain trustworthiness, whose veracity is to be judged by other data, but rather must be the standard by which all other accounts are measured.
Yeah, but to make something like that unbiased in its writing, assuming that this is not written for a specifically Christian audience, you would simply just add in the words, for the Christian viewing this text, it must be kept in mind to view it this specific way. You simply add in that little, and I haven't read this book, so I don't know if it's in there, maybe a chapter early or maybe in the intro, but you just add that little disclaimer, you add that lensing at the start, and that solves the problem of it being biased, because you're addressing the bias and you're saying exactly what you're writing this for. So if you're writing it as a way for Christians to interpret versus the way that scholars should dissect the text, it's a very different thing. So, like I said, I've read the patristics and I've read the Liturgy of the Hours. In the Liturgy of the Hours, they have different texts of the church fathers from different eras and different theologians' consensus. So what you do is you have some text that it's going to be looking at things in a literal way, is going to take other things in a scholarly way, other things in a kind of a third-party, distant kind of way. Other times it's going to be for patristics, meaning for an audience to like help them to do pastoral writings. So objective is really simple. It just means something outside of yourself that you're judging by. So your internal is going to be your relative point of view, and then an external point of view is your objective point of view. Anytime the view is outside of yourself is an objective standard or objective point of view. That is why the apologetic argument that atheists can't have objective standards is really stupid, because all you got to do is pick any of these books here, turn it into your objective standard, and you have an objective standard. It just means a standard outside of yourself that doesn't originate with yourself.
There's nowhere to go from there.
No.
That is the essence of Christian apologetics. Right?
And I have to say something, Josh, and Kip, this is me again, right, trying to analyze and get into the mind. There are several smart, and I say smart as in like these people are well read. They've read a lot of church fathers. I like to say they've read a lot of material, and they've mainly focused on with that really leaning into stuff. Like I hear people who lean into Lydia and Tim McGrew, okay, and they're like, I think these guys are like really up there in the top 10 scholars on New Testament studies. I got a friend of mine, Jeff Tripp, who they're going to...
So I actually asked this in Dan McCullen's live stream earlier today, and he didn't give me an answer to this one. He answered a different question. I think I have to pay money to get him to answer, and I'm broke. But here's the question, okay? And it's really a simple question. I have a set of books, and I actually asked this to Joshua about some of my books on Samaritan, because I got some Samaritan texts. I asked McCullen, whatever, Dan, I asked him about what's the opinion of the academic quality, or what's the the common opinion among academics on people like Kitchens, on people like, I think the guy's name is Berger or Berger, several of the key biblical scholarship books that I have in my collection, I've always been curious if the greater group actually viewed these books as high quality or if they view them as trash. I'm honestly curious about that because, yeah, I mean, I can go to Barnes and Noble and buy a book right now on any of these topics. Even if it agrees with them, that doesn't mean the quality of the work in the book is any good. So I've often wondered that about these books that I spend a significant amount of money on. That's why I kind of like the ancient church fathers better than the modern scholars, because kind of everyone agrees on the quality of the work. There's been thousands of years of opinions on whether or not that work is good or the work shouldn't be read. That those opinions exist. With modern work, you're kind of taking a crapshoot as a layperson going to a bookstore and buying something that's at the scholarly level. And I would not recommend reading almost anything at the popular level. It's almost all trash, and it's almost all just going to be like, "Hey, whatever you're doing, you're on the right track. You're good. You're right." Like, you don't want to read that. You want to read stuff that's going to challenge you. So even Bart Ehrman's popular stuff is not something I would recommend. Read his scholarly work. If you're into Jordan Peterson, go read Maps of Meaning. Don't bother with 12 Rules for Life.
Going to be, hearing from soon, who did a critique of Bauckham on his eyewitness testimony stuff.
wow.
He wrote a book actually criticizing Bauckham's John eyewitness, the Gospel of John. Like, so many things. Jesus doesn't even get his own words right in that gospel compared to his own words in earlier places. But the people who are his enemies do. He goes down into the nitty gritty.
Okay, that is a good, Jordan, thank you for that. That's actually a good conversation piece. So Jordan says this: I thought objective was outside of any subject of perspective. That's an interesting way to put it, and I'm pretty sure you can find a dictionary with that definition. For me personally, I like to go to two sources for my definitions on almost all things. Is that on my shirt? On all things. So I like going to the Oxford Encyclopedic Dictionary. It's the one that was made popular by Gilmore Girls. I know. And then the other one that I like to go to is Oxford's Dictionary of Philosophical Terms. That one is just really good. I've bought in a few of their other dictionaries on specific subjects, but their one on philosophy just is excellent for doing research and stuff like that. So if you look at objectivity in those type of dictionaries, the more encyclopedic, the more jargon-ish dictionaries, you're going to see that when you use it in a technical sense, you're talking about an outside perspective from yourself. Now, if you're talking about ultimate objectivity, you've added another term to it. You've added a qualifier. So the more qualifiers you add to the term, the more specific the definition is to the application that you're studying. So in medicine, just to give you an example, whether you call this, a bicep, or whether you call it, whatever the Latin is for bicep. That was probably a bad example. But if you let's say the calves, if you're going to call it the calves, you're going to call it, whatever muscle you want to call it, the glutes, gluteus maximus, the butt, the thorax, the chest. The terminology is going to change with who you're talking to. So there actually used to be, they don't sell them anymore, but back in the 80s, I'm very old, you could go buy weightlifter anatomy books. And in these books, all the body parts had completely different names than the names you would actually see in your textbook at school. So it's just something to think about. Yes, an objective point of view can be another person. So it's subjective to the other person. So our objective morality is subjective to God. Okay? And that's something a lot of people get wrong, both on the atheistic side and on the theistic side. The morals are subjective to God, or relative to God. They're not relative to us. So to us, God's morals are objective because he's the standard that's outside of ourselves. And the Christian claim is that God is outside of time, outside of reality. So it's an ultimate objective. Ultimate truth, ultimate reality is God. If you're not making that argument and you're arguing for an anthropomorphic God that's within the universe, your argument dies. Your argument will not stand against any kind of criticism that these type of learned scholars are giving. So you got to remember that. Objective has to be outside of yourself. Ultimate objectivity has to be outside of all creation. And if you can go beyond that, then go beyond that. But whatever you can think of as the most ultimate, which is what the word means, objective, that's going to be where God is. If you don't believe in objective truth, you're not arguing, when you say that statement, you're not arguing that you don't believe in an ultimate objective truth because you don't have the qualifier. You're arguing that there's no truth outside of yourself. And so that's what a lot of Christians and apologists do. They attack that straw man. You're making a syntactual error in your statement. And that's what they're arguing over. They're arguing over semantics. They're not arguing over ultimate truth because you already made the mistake and they're not going to correct you. They're just going to attack.
Into the Greek and source material and stuff like a whole textual critic would. But one day he had a medical procedure taking place, so he's laid up for a few days. He said, "What's that book called again?" So
the thing is that these are just rhetorical linguistic tricks that are used. You can't. So Odd said, just for the audience that's listening, ultimate doesn't seem to, and I can't see because there's a heart in the way, but doesn't seem something very clear either. So the language that we're using is technical language. These are all, if you go to word logic, these are all words that mean something in the what we would call symbolic logic. It's a way of wording a problem, like wording a math problem, and the and the but and the if all have distinctions to them. So the dividing symbol, the adding symbol, the multiply symbol, all of these things mean something in actuality. It's not just random nonsense. So these are linguistic arguments and linguistic tricks that are done by logicians. And that's how we're arguing. We're arguing on rhetoric. We're not arguing on whether or not it's true or not. Hence, objective truth is a qualifier to get you outside of these kind of symbolic arguments, which can be torn down by anyone who's taken an intro to Phil class or an intro to logic class.
I ended up getting him the book, Lydia McGrew's book. And I said, "Hey, read this book since you got the time. Start reading it." He started reading it. We had a phone conversation. I'm not going to go into the details because I want to tease people until they see. But he was just like, she just outright says nothing else matters but the New Testament. And like, I don't care about any other sources. I'm literally only caring about this. Right. It's outright coming forward. And these very sophisticated, they write well. Their grammar is way better than mine. I mean, I don't even get sentences right half the time. And I'm listening to them and I'm going, you are so driven in I just have to think.
So Jordan, and I got to say, I got to give props to you, man. You did really great holding your own in my comments section. I have been the lone Christian and the lone theist in very, very deep atheistic waters in comment sections before. And believe me, that is tough to do. So I appreciate you being able to hold your own and keeping your patience and not insulting fellow audience members in the comments section. But you gotta. I know this seems odd for a Christian sometimes, but you have to put yourself from the other point of view. You have to be able to ask the question, "What if?" So, what if God isn't the ultimate truth? What if God isn't the objective reality? What would that look like? So when someone says they don't believe in an ultimate truth or an objective reality, you just have to let them express their point of view and then argue to them based on their understanding. Don't argue to them based on your understanding. So what I do, which a lot of apologists don't do, is I do the Stan Lee method. I don't assume we're on the same page. So I try to bring them along, which for some people, that's really enjoyable, and those are the people who subscribe to my channel. For some people, it's super boring, and those are the people who aren't interested in watching what I put out. And more people are interested in having their own opinions be validated. So those channels are the channels that do well. The top channels, atheist channels, Christian channels, they're all validating their audience. I don't validate my audience. I simply tell the truth as the best of my knowledge. And if I don't know something, I say I don't know it. Most apologists can't do that because part of their job as an actual apologist, like as someone who gets paid to do apologies, is to have a defense of the faith. So if they suddenly failed in their defense, they're no longer doing their job, and Catholic Answers or Apologia Studios or whoever will be like, why are you employed here? This guy who's a great guy, Carlo Broussard of Catholics, he's the worst. He's been the worst apologist that's ever been on Catholic Answers. And he no longer does regular shows. He's now in the background. They still take him out every once in a while, but he's not a great apologist. He's not very convincing. You get someone like Jimmy Akin, Trent Horn. I mean, from the point of view of donations, you got converts everywhere. But to me, that's soul winning. You don't need to be soul winning. You need to be telling people the truth and letting them on their own choose to either believe or not believe. And if they believe, then you've done your job, because your job is not to get them to believe. Your job is simply to spread the message. God's the one who's going to ultimately decide whether they believe or not. Or if they don't believe in God, they themselves are the ones who are going to decide. And if you're deterministic and you're into a whole Calvinistic or deterministic secular point of view, then having the argument of choosing to believe or choosing to do something is inane and will just get circular.
Bias. I mean,
Yeah.
it has to be true. You have to have it as your previous video. Yeah, and I can't.
It does have to be true though, because of the emotional attachment to it, right? Like this is one of the things that you'll find in common, I think, with most of the more popular apologists is this feature, right? There is a strong emotional attachment at the start. Lee Strobel. Had his wife had a conversion experience that greatly influenced him in his pursuit. Josh McDowell, similar sort of thing. He had this rotten upbringing as a child, and ended up coming to faith through these friendships he made with these super nice people at college, right? I've heard Mike Winger talk about his terrible childhood and just how much love and affection he received as a teenager in church, which led him.
So I didn't know that about Mike Winger. I'm so sorry that he had a horrible childhood. In the world of apologetics, Mike Winger is really low on my list of apologists that I respect for their their apologetics ability. He's not a rhetorician. If he's had training, it doesn't show. He's not convincing, but he is nice, and he is affirming. So, there's that. I used to consume a lot of Mike Winger's content for about a year or two, and I actually did a few pieces on him that actually hurt my channel because they were so negative that Christians who were watching my channel thought I wasn't a Christian because his arguments were so inane and lack logic and were so based on fallacies like emotional appeal. And I do think that is a risk. On one hand, if you want to affirm your audience, emotional appeal is super important. It just is. You got to hook people in. On the other hand, for credibility's sake, you can't let your emotional appeal overwrite the facts you're presenting. So if you have way more emotional appeal than you have actual facts, and if you actually have counterfacts, or you have not just counterfactuals, but outright lies or manipulations, then you're not converting someone into Christianity. You're just lying to them. And eventually they're going to find out the truth. Eventually they'll find out dinosaurs are real. And once that happens, you lost a convert. So you have to go in with the facts first, and you have to go in with the truth first. If that's not what you're doing, then you're a scam artist. You're not or a con man. You're not a Christian.
Him to Christ, and I mean, you could go on and on about how these people have made an investment, a deep emotional investment that at this point feel prompted to defend at all costs, it seems.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't, like what you're saying is true. Nothing else really matters at this point except for holding on to what this deep emotional attachment that people have that come through faith.
I want to add real quick, Josh. I know you could probably add to this. I feel like, and this is just my subjective little opinion here, that the more sophisticated apologists that we run into, I'll put like inspiring philosophy on this list, things like that, are actually trying to use, I would use this term, negotiate. They're trying to negotiate with the sophisticated, actual critical scholarship out.
So we don't call it negotiation. We actually call it reconciliation. So we're trying to reconcile. In the internal sense, would be one supposed contradiction with another supposed contradiction, or one book with another book. But in the greater sense, we're trying to reconcile material fact with metaphysical truth. So that's what that act is called. It's not called whatever he just said. It's not negotiation. It's called reconciliation. That's actually the theological term for it. Some Christians and some denominations will use the word discernment instead of reconciliation. I'm not sure what the technical difference there is when it's talking about the same topic, because when Catholics use discernment, it means something completely different. When you're discerning a vocation. So you're choosing something. With reconciliation, you're taking two apparently opposing facts. Yes, we would use harmonize. Hermeneutics is used both in the Catholic and Orthodox world as well as the Protestant world, but hermeneutics, you'll usually hear that more from Protestants. In fact, the only Catholic I know that uses hermeneutics strongly would be Tyler Marshall, and he comes from a Protestant worldview before he became a radical traditionalist Catholic.
Out there in some way. Now, they're not willing to negotiate in many ways, but they're trying to negotiate with the more, like, let's go to John Walton, let's stop acting like ex nihilo, or let's find a way to get a guy who's smart enough, who's playing with real serious academic stuff. He gets stuff right often. Maybe Michael Heiser on certain
that's a
things,
good
for
example.
example.
It is.
And then there's some things where you go, dude, really?
Yeah.
Like you really buy, like Michael Heiser lived.
I really do need to buy myself a shock mic stand. No, harmonize does not mean make your own gospel. Hermeneutics is actually a very old standard to Bible interpretation, and you can actually see Jesus and Paul do this in the New Testament. In my last video, which I know the mic wasn't great, the sound settings weren't right, but if you listen to that, and BS, I want you to listen to it, and I want you to put a helmet on, so that way when it sounds like it's in a bucket, it'll sound like it's proper for the helmet that you're wearing. That way you won't take off the helmet, and you can listen to the whole video. But if you listen to that video, you will see that I'm talking about that very directly. Jesus and Paul are recontextualizing the Old Testament passages, and the Bible writers, the authors, the human authors, that is, they're recontextualizing what we would call prophecy into the Christian worldview, which will be the Christian worldview going forward in the church fathers, and then later transmitted to the lay people once those writings become available to them. But the Old Testament itself is recontextualizing other parts of the Old Testament. So you have, I'm not sure if it's Daniel recontextualizing Isaiah or Isaiah recontextualizing Daniel. I forget which direction it goes. But you'll see that later authors will recontextualize previous texts to match their current situation in history. And that just keeps going on up until today. So you'll see John MacArthur, which I don't like John MacArthur, but you'll see John MacArthur doing this. You'll see Frank Turk doing this. it's just impossible to get away from. The problem is when you get so far away from recontextualization that you forget the original message. So Jesus was really good at going back to the original message to say, well, if this was about peace, forget about all this other stuff that was added on by the human writer. This was about peace. So let's go back to that goal. You live up to that goal, and now we can start talking again. So Jesus was really good at it, but that's because he's Jesus. Literally, a whole religion was built on him and Paul's reinterpretations. John MacArthur, Frank Turret, Mike Ringer are not Jesus. They're not Paul. They're not that. They're not linguistically prepared for the arguments that they're putting out there. And so they'll say something that sounds right, but they don't realize that by saying that they're negating a whole theological tradition, which is where, if you look at people like Zwingli, you look at people like Calvin, they're aware that they're throwing away a tradition to have their new reinterpretation. And they're making the argument that their new reinterpretation is the correct interpretation, and that the church was lost for 1,000 years or something. It gets more complicated than that because not all of them were cessationalist. But anyway, let's keep going. No, BS. You stay awake. You stay awake, BS.
That worldview.
B.S. Lewis, you can't go to bed. You have to stay here
right now
for the entire session.
The whole nine. So
no, I was going to say, at this point, you have to ask the question, who are these people speaking to? Does this become now, at this point, at this level that we're talking about, where you're having to develop these sophisticated arguments to maintain this worldview, is this still about defending your faith to critics, or is this more about standing for those who are like-minded in your own community and defending everybody and everything that they believe against?
Becoming the tribe or the village hero, and we are in a lot of respects the local dragon that needs to be slain.
Sure.
And they're defending it. And so there's a lot of people who aren't doing that rigorous work, even on the level of people like Heiser or Walton or whoever it might be that you might throw in the category, because I tend to think Walton's even more than what you see with Heiser. So, but like I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, there.
So to answer this, wouldn't good hermeneutics need the intention of the author in terms of what he intended to convey to his audience, which would require the author's I'm guessing the word missing there is access to the author's mind. Yes, that is exactly correct, but we don't have access to God in that way. Only Jesus does, because Jesus is God. So we don't have access to that, unless you're a charismatic and you're going to say that the Holy Spirit is talking to you and giving you the correct interpretation. Most people are not charismatics, so I would be very cautious about trying to speak for God. But let me say what I was about to do. So I actually answer this in my video review of Satan's Guide to the Bible, and I'm going to give just that part here where I'm saying what the proper function of apologetics, polemics, and hermeneutics are. So what I am going to argue for is that, let me see, where is it? So I say apologetics, polemics, and hermeneutics, when applied in accordance with orthodox principles, are instrumental in revealing the truths of the Bible. Contrary to the documentary's portrayal and to this guy's opinion, these disciplines were not mere weapons for proselytizing or advancing agendas. Instead, they served the noble purpose of presenting and defending faith in an intellectually rigorous manner. Similarly, exegesis, deconstruction, and reconstruction are not inherently evil, as some Christians fear. interpretation and recontextualizing text as done by Paul and Jesus in the New Testament in regards to the Old are valid practices. However, such endeavors must remain within orthodoxy as given by the church fathers and be guided by tradition as given by Jesus to avoid strain into heresy. Now, those three pillars are the three pillars that Catholicism believes were given by God. So if you remember when they were arguing about God breathed in the James White Trent Horn debate. For some reason, Trent Horn just couldn't say it, but I can say it here. God breathed out three pillars, or some might even say four pillars. So those three pillars are going to be tradition, scripture, and the church. You need all three. And then on top of that, you need a fourth one. You need the Holy Spirit. So we would say liturgy for another term that we would be using there as a pillar. But the four pillars of truth, or the four pillars of the church, no pillar can stand on its own. So it's not as if the church has authority over the Bible has authority over the Spirit, or the Spirit has authority over this. That's not what we're saying. So it's that all three of them are equally authoritative, and they can't contradict each other. And if they start contradicting each other, you know you've gone in the wrong direction. That's the whole argument. That's why there's not just one track in Catholicism, and that's why there's not just one track in Orthodoxy. In Eastern Orthodoxy, you need tradition. Otherwise, your interpretation of Scripture can go well off into different directions. You need both tracks for the train to go forward, is the way an Orthodox person would say it. And a Catholic would then add, well, but you also need a conductor, which would be the magisterium, which includes the Pope. Okay, let's keep going.
They're trying to negotiate. Those are the ones that are pretty sophisticated in their approach. But I heard it once said by a scholar, and I'm not going to name names, but they said something that I thought was really interesting about apologetics. You mentioned it's just like for our community. I'm kind of preaching it to my choir. I think that's true. I also think it might be true that they think it's intellectual, and they're like, hey, if it's true, then it's obviously logical, rational. It's the most sensical because it's true. Starting with that experience, leading them there. Yeah. But I really think that the real reason that might boil down for a lot of them, this is me psychoanalyzing, but I do think it's the case, is they're convincing themselves. Sure. They're trying to tell that person in the mirror.
So I don't like that answer at all. So there are more than a few passages in the Bible that I, especially when I was more hedonistic, I found, if not offensive, at least problematic for the way that I lived my life. And coming to terms, reconciling what the Bible said with the way that I lived my life was very difficult and took a very long time. And I would rather deny what the Bible was saying than live the way that the Bible was saying to live. So what he's saying here is very untrue for most Christians' lived experience. Most Christians' lived experience, it would be much easier to follow their inclinations than to follow the dictates of the Bible. So I disagree with this take right here.
Hey, what you're believing in isn't silly. Put those doubts down. You have the most rational, true belief in the world, and convincing themselves. I did not go on this path to listen to Michael Licona. I heard him once or twice, but he was younger when I first started to get into the scene. It was William Lane Craig. It was Ravi Zacharias. It was these guys. I read The Case for Christ and The Case for Creator, Lee Strobel. These guys were really trying to, and it was...
You know, what's interesting is that I never ran into any of those speakers until I started interacting with atheists. I almost, and this statement might be a little bit too strong, but I think it's justified. If these people who you're mentioning are the people who led you to atheism, even if they're professing Christians, they probably have the wrong message. They're getting something fundamentally wrong if the majority of their congregation, or even a strong even a large minority of their conversation, are using their exact wording as reasons to leave the faith. Maybe they're saying something wrong. So maybe they don't have a good understanding, even if they themselves think they do. That's just an opinion. And it might not even be a correct opinion, but it's an opinion. It's mine.
It's my journey at first to know that it was true for myself.
Yeah.
Along that path, I started going, oh, I can argue this online, and I can convince others to try and get Christians on the right track, but also stand up to skeptics and tell them why I'm not an idiot for believing in my particular fundamentalist position or something. Because I think they feel that. We think they're idiots, and we don't. I think that there is a sense in which the brain is kind of hijacked, though,
Sure.
to argue for things that, again, to your point of the grip,
But I mean, like,
Yeah, you
there's something that happens when you dedicate enough time to a particular subject matter to, like, get a PhD in it. There's something that happens, and it's you realize the vast nature of the data that needs to be mastered in order to understand it. And
So I'm not exactly sure where he's going there, but I do have a comment on that. So the first time I read the Bible all the way through, I was, I'm going to say I was somewhere in my 20s, and late 20s, I'm going to say. And it didn't feel like an accomplishment the first time because it took me so long to do it. The second time I read it through, it did feel like an accomplishment, and it was either in the second or the third reading when I went back to the church. And it was not because I was agreeing with what it was saying. It's because I disagreed with what Paul was saying so much. So there's a real interesting thing that happens if you read the Bible in order and you include the ecumenical books, or what Protestants like to call the Apocrypha, what Catholics call the Deuterocanonical books, basically the extended canon as exists in Orthodoxy, not just in the Catholic one. You want all the books. You get a real picture for how revolutionary everything Jesus says. Well, then Jesus dies and is resurrected and gives the Paraclete to the apostles, and you're like, yeah, let's rock and roll. And then Paul is muted, and he's like, wait, we need rules. And you're like, what? And Paul's like, yeah, and I know that I'm taking a lot of patronage from this chick named Priscilla, and I know she's a deaconess in the church, but women shouldn't really be speaking in the church. And you're like, oh, what? And then you have Acts where the eunuch is being accepted, and then you have Paul going, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Yeah, Jesus said that none of this stuff is real. It doesn't matter, but you better not be breaking the rules. And so Paul has a very different message than what Jesus said, at least from first appearance, from the first three read-throughs of the Bible. At least I was unconvinced of Paul's Christianity. What Paul was saying seemed to contradict Jesus' message. And so that's where my theological journey began. It wasn't reading the Bible, because I could have just read the Bible 3 times and been satisfied with saying, hey, I read the Bible. It was from that I went to different churches and different denominations and even different faiths to try to find answers to my objections to Paul, to these hurdles, these stumbling stones that Paul had become. And it was through that I found the Liturgy of the Hours, and it was through the Liturgy of the Hours that I got a greater perspective. And it was through the Liturgy of the Hours that I started seeing different church fathers have what I would have as a modern lapsed Catholic would have thought of as modern secular, modern humanistic points of view on the Bible. You have the church fathers, the founders of the Catholic faith, the founders of Christian dogma, stating views that sound very much like everything that Bart Ehrman says, very much like things like Joshua Bowman says. And these are the people who Christians throughout history have looked at as luminaries of understanding the faith. And so right there, you're like, oh, the Protestant view doesn't work because the historical Christian view matches up with what these secular scholars are saying. And these secular scholars are secular coming out of Protestantism. So you go, okay, well, wait, there's something else going on here. And so then you start reading more and more texts. And so I think when I was doing, a few years ago, when I was doing Mike Winger's commentary on Mike Winger stuff, I thought I'd reached almost the end. I read the majority of the church fathers. I read all the major works. I was like, okay, I'm reading the documents of the faith. I'm reading all of the ecumenical councils. I'm reading all the modern councils. I'm catching up with all of this stuff because I've been in debates with Muslims where the Muslims would pull out councils and it would just throw me off and I didn't know what was going on. So I read all that stuff and I was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for this stuff. And then I find out about the patristic writings and I find out about the commentaries done by the church fathers. Well, now I have 120 some, 150 some books in my bedroom where I have to read all this stuff so that way I can know even more. So I will give Bowman the benefit here. He is correct. When you start getting into this, and you don't have to be a doctorate, you don't have to go to school to buy all these books. You can go buy the translations. There are good translations available. But the amount of information out there, proper, correct information, is immense. And the amount of later scholarship that's just reinterpreting these older points of view is mostly nonsense. So you don't need, and I love Trent Horn, I love Jeremy Aiken. I'm not saying that their books are wrong or that they're bad. I'm saying you're reading an interpretation of a translation of commentary when the commentary itself is available to be read. So instead of buying a book that just kind of cherry picks different pieces, go buy the actual book and read it yourself. Yes, it takes longer. I've been reading these books now for over 7 years, and I'm nowhere near done. But yeah, you got to just keep going. There's way more than 150 some books, by the way. I once looked at the entire collection. I've spent a few $1,000s on all these books.
One of the things, and I'm thinking back to my 26 years as a fundamentalist evangelical, when I was like 2/3 of the way through my master's degree, and even before that, but maybe up to that point, I would have felt and did feel at times comfortable walking and marching in to any pastor, any scholar, walking in and saying, I know what all the books on your shelf say.
I'm just glad I haven't started calling him bow tie.
To tell you, I was a mid-acts dispensationalist, right? So like I could go through the Bible and like shout out all these verses, right? This connects to this, and this develops this, and this proves this, and this connects up here to Acts, and this one goes back here to Romans, blah, 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 right? I knew that I knew everything about it, right? And I always give this example.
I do feel like maybe they're, not all of them, but I do feel like some of these anti-theist popular YouTubers, that it's their, I'll let the scene clear so it doesn't look like I'm having camera problems again.
You know, if you're
That it does seem like it's their arrogance that led to their downfall of faith. That they were too confident in what they understood of the Bible, that when it was proven wrong, there went their faith. Because they weren't believing in the Bible, they were believing in their understanding. It just seems that way. And if they're doing armchair psychology, so can I. It's only fair.
If you're walking down a hallway and you're like 50 feet from the door at the end, and the door is open and you're looking into the other room.
Okay. So it's your first day as a freshman in college, and you're about to play some pickup street basketball. It's college, so pick up frisbee. And it's these two guys. And you have to pick which team you're on. Who are you picking? Are you picking the more athletic looking dude or the more nerdy looking dude? That's the question. Because if you pick the more athletic looking dude, he might just suck at the sport, while the more nerdy looking dude's been there long enough that he might have picked up some skills with frisbee or pickup basketball. That's the question. That's what we got to really ask here.
You can only see this much of the room. It's whatever the width of the door is. But because you're 50 feet from it, your line of sight won't allow anymore. If you take...
And again, I had already been reading the scholarship for a very long time, long before I went back to Christian, long before I identified as a Catholic again, or as a Christian again, while I was away from the church. While I was identifying as a Stoic and a Taoist, I was reading a lot of the academia that's out there. I was taking courses online because I was curious about the development of the Bible. But my world didn't open up until I found out about the Church Fathers. Because even when you're reading through some academia, they'll mention Church Fathers, but it doesn't ring out to you like a specific group, like a specific set of writings. So... So to me, what Dr. Bowen is saying is correct in a sense. Like I said, my world opened up when I discovered the Church Fathers. My understanding of Christianity changed vastly. But it didn't make me more liberal. It brought me into more conservative and more traditional views. I used to be very liberal. And if you would have asked me, I wouldn't have told you I was liberal. I told you, no, I'm a Catholic and I happen to have these stances. But now that I've read the Church Fathers, I've seen the error of those stances when it comes to having a theological viewpoint. You can't have both. You can't, the whole, lukewarm water, spit it out. You have to be hot or cold. Same thing. You can't be lukewarm on some of these things. You have to have the full knowledge, and you have to make a decision of whether or not this is something that you can deal with in your faith. You can't. And if you can't deal with it in your faith, then it's not true faith. If you can't deal with the realities of warfare or the realities of literatural techniques and tropes in writing, like if you can't deal with the way ancient writers wrote, how are you going to stand face to face with someone in real life and live up to your principles? If you can't hold on to your principles when it's only being challenged in theory, how are you going to hold on to your principles when you're challenged with a real temptation to do the easy but evil thing? So I do think this stuff is super important. I don't think it's a joke, but I also think that you shouldn't lose your faith over these kind of issues. There are bigger issues that the Bible is addressing, including how you live your life.
Take 5 steps forward, how much more of that room can you see?
Out of 50 feet, not much.
Not much, right?
You're seeing until you're right up on it.
But man, you've taken 5 steps forward. Think about all the ground.
Okay, so are not prophecies from Jordan, are not prophecies open to interpretation? Well, they are, but the problem is that a lot of so-called prophecies are apocalyptic, and a lot of things that Christians identify as prophecies were not prophecies in the original intent of the text. You have to understand that the moment you are doing Christian interpretation to Hebrew writings, you're no longer going with the interpretation of the original audience. Audience intent and human author intent is right out the window. So you can say intent of the Holy Spirit, intent of God, and that's where I think Bowen and Dr. Dan McLean do hit a foul ball. They're not willing to accept that once these narratives are in a single collection, they now interpret each other. And that is a single view. That is a unified voice. That unified voice is the Bible, but it's harmonized through, as a Catholic, 72 different voices, plus however many redactors, writers, editors, whoever's gotten a hold of it. I mean, you're talking about a myriad of voices. And for a Catholic, that would be all three levels of the church. I mean, all the voices of the church are singing together. The church militant, the church suffering, and the church triumphant are all singing together the meaning of the text in a single word. And we all know the word Jesus. But when you're doing critical analysis, that's not open to you for how you interpret a text. So you can interpret the meaning that way, but you first have to acknowledge what the text was originally talking about. Otherwise, you're just lying. And you shouldn't be lying to your audience. So I do, just because I don't agree with their skepticism doesn't mean that I don't agree with the facts. Their facts are fine. And just because I agree with an apologist's end point of view, which is that God is real and that the Bible is inspired, doesn't mean that I agree with their tactics, which are dishonest and slimy.
You've covered. My God, what you now understand must be immensely more. It's not until you get all the way down in that room and you stop.
The moment you think you know everything, you've just shown that you know nothing.
And you turn around and see that this is a 3-story library. All this data that
You're welcome.
What you have to master has now exponentially grown. But you've gone so much further, but you know relatively so much less. And this, I am convinced, is the experience of people in the church, experience of people online, right? People that haven't had I'm trying to say that I was very, very fortunate to have the experience to walk down that hallway and get all the way into that room.
I'm going to turn on the fan. I'll be right
But I
back.
realize now how little I know, comparatively speaking. Now, I know a fuck ton more, right?
I was waiting for it.
But there's no way I'm going to be able to master all the data that's in this 3-story library.
You
right?
do know what you just did, though. You literally gave a story of Dunning-Kruger.
Yes.
Literally
Yes, yeah.
told us
Okay.
the
Sure.
Dunning-Kruger
My legs are
effect.
starting to get
It was
tired,
just a polite
guys.
way of
What do you
saying
think?
it, 'cause people don't like to hear that.
We
10 more
all
minutes?
I mean, I'm sure that you did. I know that I did.
Are you wanna-
On that journey to that room, you go through these stages. Well, I read a book. I read 2 books. Oh boy, and this one came up with something I've never heard before. And
Before I came to the Bible, I tried reading the Bible for the first time when I was 15 years old, and it was a terrible paraphrase called The Book from the 700 Club. And I couldn't get past the Giants. Not the Giants, I'm sorry. Was it the Giants? I think I got past Leviticus. It was either the Numbers or it was the part with the Giants. Anyway, I went on to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, actually, hold on. Where's my Caesar? In exactly this order, okay? Guys, is there sound right now? Because I stepped away. I don't know if the sound is down. Okay. As long as you guys are hearing me. In exactly this order. These are the actual books, by the way. These are them right here. Except not this one. This should be Hesiod. I meant to grab Hesiod. I'm not going to get up again. I don't know where Hesiod is. So exactly in this order, I went the Odyssey, which was really hard to do. The Iliad, which I should have read first. So I went Odyssey, Iliad. I went Hesiod's Theogony and Working Days, which is somewhere back here. I just don't know where. Then I went... this is the Peloponnesian War. It's not the one I meant to grab. Look at how many times I went through this book. See all that tape to hold it together? I went to the histories. Then I went to the Peloponnesian War, which was the worst, like one of the worst reads. This one in the Castle of Montiago, or whatever. Ugh, it's a giant. And then I went to Caesar, and I like this one more than I like this one, by the way. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I like this one more than I like this one. But I went through Caesar, and then from there, I just took a deep dive into mythology, starting off with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which I then went to the Mesopotamian myths, and I went through all the myths of all the world, including China and Japan and India, went deep into Hinduism. I'm talking about the text, just reading through all of this stuff. All the way up into the 70s and 60s, where I started reading, books about Wiccan and things by Thomas Clary and Crowley. I just went all through all of that before I ever got back to the Bible. I didn't get back to the Bible till I was 33. Okay? So I went a long time, from 15 to, let's say, 30, before I really got back into the Bible. And it was 33 before I converted back into the church. So I read a lot of text before I went to that.
It must be brilliant
Good night,
because
P-Town.
it's answering all the questions. And there's a really funny way of how people's interpretive models seem to account for all the data points. Because if you don't know what all the data points are, this model can seem to fit it. And that's the issue here. So when you read an article from 1983,
Thank you,
it's
Tex.
5 pages
Tux.
long, and it says, look, here's
pages,
and this
Josh.
right 6 pages. Sorry, and look, here's a chiastic structure that accounts.
Okay,
for
I might go
everything.
more
Well,
than
if
10
you
minutes.
can't read goddamn Sumerian, right? Or you can't read Akkadian, or you haven't worked at these texts.
Why latch onto that little article from 1983 then?
Yeah, it's
Hey, excuse me, Mr. Bowman, bow tie. I showed you the books that I have of multiple translations of the Sumerian text, and you on stream said they were good translations. Are you taking that back now?
It's just there's so much out there, and again, I was as guilty of this as anybody. But I guess what I'm saying is, like, there's an anti-intellectualism out there, and that anti-intellectualism, I think, comes from a place of I don't want to feel insecure in what I know. I don't want to have.
By the way, I have several books on the meaning of runes, and I don't think any of them are accurate. I don't think a single one of my books on the meaning of runes are accurate, because every single book translates the X differently. All the rest of the symbols, fairly similar. The X, different definition every single time.
Have to say these people that have dedicated 15 years of their lives to grad school and have been doing this in the field for 20 years or 30 years or whatever, that they know more than I do about this. And I'm not going to be able to attain that level unless I go do.
But see, that's a false standard, because I'm not talking about him specifically, but I've debated scholars, I've debated people with PhDs, and I've won debates against people who have that pedigree. I'm married to a PhD, and I run arguments more than a few of the times. So this is not. Well, it's not that not everyone's meant to be, Jordan. It's not that everyone's not meant to be an intellectual. You don't have to be an intellectual, but you also don't have to be an academic to be an intellectual. I started this reading journey when I was 15, and I couldn't finish the first quarter of the Bible. And I was like, there has to be something else that I can read. Mind you, I did it to impress a girl, because the girl called me daft, and I felt like an idiot because I didn't know what the word daft meant. So I was like, I'm going to read. Beside the point. Going through this journey, reading all the ancient history and deciding to go back to the beginning of literature and the beginning of human writing, I don't think most people would choose that method of A, learning how to read, and B, going through and trying to find worldly ideas. I get that. I get that journey, specific journey, is not for everyone. But anybody can pick up these books and anybody can start reading them. You know, one of the great things about the internet, the great things about current technology is that even the even these scholarly college level writings that you could only get access to if you were subscribed to a specific journal that talked about this topic is now available to the world. So this information is now out there. So I don't think it's just simply anti-intellectualism. Yes, I've run into that too. And again, I didn't start running into that until my previous career. But there's also the factor that just not everybody has enough time to read all this stuff. Sometimes it's not that people don't know. It's that the reason why they choose the apologetical work instead of reading this, what I'm reading, is because this is almost 1,000 pages, and I can go get a summary that's 120 some pages and still talk about it.
What it is that they do, or I have some crazy high IQ and I'm in a very
Also, in a lot of these, and I know this because I have more than a few PhDs in my family, a lot of them do not actually read these books. They read summary books, or they read almost like Cliff Note versions, but they're like these little academic summaries, or sometimes they call them readers, that have all the important texts. And so they're also not reading the nuances. So don't let them fool you.
fortunate circumstance to be able to dedicate just tons and tons of time to reading. And the issue here, I think, is that bolstering this is the online access that we have to information that we don't actually know is not reputable. And if you can read it somewhere and it makes sense and it fits the data points and it sort of tickles your.
And again, I'm going to say that's why I like ancient sources. I like going to reputable publishers. I like getting books that are. So you do need one source book style book, okay? You're going to need one study Bible, or you're going to need one history of mathematics book, something that's going to reference these books so you know which ones are quality. But then you need to go to a reputable publisher. You need to find a reputable translation. Just nowadays you can go online and see who says what's a good translation or not. You know, you read enough reviews. But back in the day, you would just read the back cover and you'd compare them. And then if you had access to a list of, kind of like a professor's list almost, and you can go see what their status is and their writing, if they're considered a kook or not. And from there, go buy the book. It's that easy.
Your desire, that didn't make any sense as an analogy, but it satisfies the longing that you have to answer these. It's so easy to grab onto that because you don't know what's in that room. You just know this little bit that you see.
I like that. I like that. Dennis McDonald, I did a recording with him. There was a 4-panel responding to some of his mimetic work. We had Stephen Boyce. We had Eric Manning from the Christian Apologist channel.
That's right.
Yeah, then we had Tim McGrew, and then we had I can't remember the fourth person. Yeah. And so Dennis responded.
And also, in a weird way, it's funny that these now anti-Protestant secularists are kind of creating their own magisterium. I don't know if you kind of see that, but you know how like the dark web or the dark triad or the dark intellectual, whatever the heck. This is kind of like a counter dark magisterium. You know, you got like the shadow government. You have the shadow magisterium here, which is where you have these intellectuals who are using scholarly and academic consensus the same way that theologians in Catholicism and Orthodoxy use the bishops. So these are your new bishops. And they're the ones with access to the time to study all this material and read all the extra books. So that way they can give you an opinion of what their opinion of what all the other collected opinions are. They are, in a way, their own magisterium. That's what they're becoming. And I can see how a Protestant, let's just say a Calvinist or an Anglican, who their whole reason for protesting against the church was to get away from this kind of authoritative view, to then have a new authority in secular scholarship. I can see how that would be incredibly maddening. But as a Catholic, I don't have that problem.
Yeah.
And he saw the whole stream that they did. We did a response video later on, but this was while I was in California recorded. And he says, Derek, I'm going to say this very kindly. Dennis is one of the most soft, humbling guys. If you talk to him, he wouldn't hurt a fly. In fact, I hope he sticks around for another 20 years because it's sad. This guy's that he's been even in academia not treated the way he could be. Believe it or not. But the problem is what he knows is a skill. There was a time in the
Jordan, I am now doing this full time. Spread that around. Spread Dark Magisterium. Get people to come to this channel, to watch this channel, just because I said that. That is great. I love how clever that sounds. I love that I said it. Put it out there. Let's get people watching this show. Let's make that a thing. Let's make Dark Magisterium a thing for these specific set of scholars. They want to call themselves the Diablo critiques or critics or something like that. No. Dark Magisterium. That's going to be their new name.
70s and 60s that they were actually training a mixture of New Testament and classicist to learn the Greek and go back into Homer and actually learn this material. New Testament scholars aren't told or trained to read this stuff. This is something that he has a specialty on. And it's a very, very niche specialty, which puts him already on the outside of most New Testament scholars. But he said, Derek, I'm going to say this about them. And I don't mean this disrespectful, but they are intellectual anti-intellectuals.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it hit. I was like, ooh, because they're smart.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But they are working against the data,
Yeah.
the evidence. They're trying to do something rather than work with what scholarship is actually saying here.
You know, it did, and I am benefiting from that. But a lot of people don't have that luxury, right? They have to go out into the workforce. They have families they have to take care
Okay,
of.
my legs
And
are
they
starting to get tired.
a
I need to
place
work
where
out.
it's
I need to wake up early to
I'm
make up
not
for lost
going to
time
be able to
with my
have the
job today
money,
that I
have
did
the
not
time to go get a
do.
master's degree and then go get a
So-
PhD. Like, I'm just not going to have time to do it.
I'm going to go
But
4
I
more minutes
want
unless they hit
to
another
know,
really
right?
interesting
I
topic,
want
and then
to
we'll come
be
back tomorrow and do the next
somebody
live stream.
that is an authority on this. So what do? Well, like, I think people just say, well, if I just read, the right people, or if I just, get under the right scholar on YouTube or something, and then I read what they tell me, like then I can battle with the best of them, and it can seem that you really have a command of the data. It can feel like you have a command of the data, and you just.
Again, I do think he's holding the scholarship a little bit too high. Some of the best, throughout the history of academia, some of the best discoveries were made by people who didn't know what they were talking about or didn't know what they were doing. And yeah, sometimes they destroyed the data that they found. Sometimes they came close to the correct answer, and it took a scholar afterwards to actually correct their findings to make the findings accurate. But I do think he's going a little bit too high here with, he's just going too high here with the praise for scholarly academia. And I've heard this from very, very, very many doctorates. Having a doctorate degree doesn't show that you're smart. It shows that you're good at studying. And don't get me wrong, it is an achievement, but it doesn't have anything to do with your intellectual prowess.
You just don't. You've only moved a couple feet down that hallway. You just don't know it. And so then it builds this confidence that then you hear people say when they get in frustrating circumstances, oh, so-called Dr. Bowen, so-called Dr. Davis, right? And that's where that sort of thing
More
comes from.
recently on user has been accusing me now of what is it? It's my white Western elitist historicist bias. Like
Wow.
I don't even know what to do with that. Like
And what
I want to hear them go anti-woke. I just want to hear it. I know I don't have time for it. I know I got other things I got to do. All right, I'm going to go one more minute, and then I'm going to start closing out, okay?
context?
as a means of basically of saying this is what historical criticism is it's an attempt to, it's taking a modern method and ham-fistingly, you know, applying it to these ancient texts as a means to try and understand them, but can't possibly, because it's not getting inside the, I think, inside the milieu or inside that. But it's a form of this kind of intellectual anti-intellectualism,
Yeah.
where you apply a label to someone, you know, liberal scholars,
Yeah, like a poisoning the well. Sort
or
of
yeah,
thing,
it
So I don't think it's just poisoning the well. I don't think that complaint is simply a poisoning the well. It can be used that way, but I do think there is. There's not only an anti-intellectualism in some fundamental groups. I mean, there's no denying that, but there is also this arrogance and this ham-fisting of the facts done by, and there's no other way to say it, by white intellectual scholars, by the academia. And I think the academy does that because it's insular. Because you look at something, let's just take Greek culture, for instance, and the way that it's portrayed in film, as Greek and Roman culture as being this, especially Greek culture, but Roman culture as well, as being this very liberal, very open society. And that's not what it was. The women were not allowed to interact with the men. The houses were actually segregated. And in ancient Jewish society, it's the same thing. And you're not allowed to actually interact with the foreign culture that you're trading with. Like, you have to somehow establish trade while keeping social distancing, so that you're not influenced by a pagan culture. There's all these subtle rules and subtle differences in society from the modern perspective. And if you read a lot of the quote unquote modern scholarship, which I spent some time doing before I could afford to buy these things. Actually, this is not even that expensive. There's way more expensive versions of this kind of stuff. But before I had the money for that, and I don't have the money for it now, like that period of my life is now gone. But while I had the money for it, it was very nice. But when you read the scholarship, the quote unquote modern scholarship, it is very Anglo-European centric, and their understanding of these ancient societies are almost mirrors of European society or mirrors of American society. And that's just not what it was like in these cultures. These cultures were very segregated. They didn't have an idea of race, but they did have an idea of peoples. They did have an idea of nationality. And they had an idea of patron gods. And what god you worship defined who you were, not just socially, but even culturally and ethnically. You know, they were looking at it as a religion. Your culture was your identity, not so much your skin color. But it was greatly divided, and it was greatly, it was not this wild society without rules. These are very intellectual, very intelligent people. Some of them very well read, some of them, well, not well read, well cultured societies and cultivated societies. So there is an arrogance here where, because we're moderns, we know better. And because our society is like this, then this should be reflected in ancient times. And it's just not that way. And it happens to almost all of us, but I see it with a lot of these scholars, where when they're arguing against the evangelical understanding of something, or the inerrant understanding of something, they're projecting a level of modern society back into the ancient society they're speaking about. And I just think that's a mistake. And it's very anachronistic to put our modern morals onto the morals of a society that had no concept of these types of rights. And that anachronism, that intellectual arrogance, I think does put a barrier between the layperson who's just trying to understand the basics of the Bible or the basics of Herodotus or the basics of Caesar, and the scholar who's trying to argue for an agenda or a point of view that he put forth in a dissertation. Because that opinion could be wrong. I get it, you did the research, congratulations, but your opinion could still be wrong, and you're arguing for your opinion because that's what you base your career on, that's how you graduated. Again, congratulations on graduating. That doesn't mean you're right. It just means you did enough work and enough study to earn the credits to graduate. All right. Peace, like, and subscribe. Talk to you all later. I'll probably have to edit out the sound of me opening the soda, unless the new mic settings corrected it and made it sound like opening a soda. If not, this will be up probably tomorrow morning. If I do have to edit, it'll probably be up tomorrow afternoon as a video on my channel.